Assalamu alaikum, hello, and welcome to the Voice of Islam Living History program. My name is Dr. Mohammed Iqbal. I'm your host for today's program, and I'm joined by our panelists, Amjad, Hussain, and Arif Ahmad. Welcome, both of you.
Thank you,
Thank
Dr.
you.
Mo.
This is the second part of our program discussing the Abbasid Caliphate and their great achievements. In this second part, we're going to look at the golden age of the Abbasid period, where some of the greatest scholars on earth came together to produce some wonderful themes in relation to science, art, and culture. Just to set the scene, let me read you a quote from Robert Briffault in Making of Humanity, and he writes, "What we call science arose in Europe as a result of a new spirit of inquiry, of new methods of investigation, of the method of experiment, and of the development of mathematics in a form unknown to the Greeks. That spirit and those methods were introduced into the European world by the Arabs. Modern science is the most momentous contribution of the Islamic civilization." That's a wonderful quote, setting out the importance of the Islamic civilization. But not everybody knows about this, and not everybody is aware of it. But clearly, some of the great historians have written about this, Arif. And I know we were talking earlier on about Professor Hitti, who wrote the history of the Arabs, and what he said.
Yeah, just before I make the quote that he said, I'd just like to just pass on to our listeners one of the hadiths which guided the principles. And the hadith that is often recited in this connection is the ink of a scholar is more holy than the blood of a martyr. And this just shows how in Islam, in such high esteem, inquiry and being scholarly, it's important to our faith. The quote from Professor Hitti in the History of the Arabs, he's written as follows: in 3/4 of a century after the establishment of Baghdad, the Arabic reading world was in possession of the chief philosophical works of Aristotle, of the leading Platonic commentators, and of most of the medical writings of Galen, as well as of Persian and Indian scientific works. In only a few decades, Arab scholars assimilated what had taken the Greeks centuries to develop. So this shows not only how much progress was made, but how rapid that progress was made. And it was part of this inquiry and this constant thirst and yearning for knowledge, which meant that they gained so much information in such a short period of time.
Now, Amjad, I know a lot of people in the West quite often say, "Well, really, it was it was the Greeks and the Romans, and then through Enlightenment, the Europeans really that developed scientific thinking and everything." But clearly, that is not the case. The Muslims and their transmission to Europe had a major part to play in it, didn't they?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, whereas the Greeks systemized, generalized, and theorized, but the patient ways of investigation, the accumulation of positive knowledge, the minute methods of science, detailed and prolonged observation, and experimental inquiry were altogether alien to the Greek temperament. What we call science arose in Europe as a result of new spirit of inquiry, of new methods of investigation, of the methods of experimentation, and the development of mathematics in a form unknown to the Greeks. That spirit and those methods were introduced into the European world by the Arabs. And of course, as my esteemed colleague has mentioned, there has been emphasis repeatedly by the Prophet Mohammed that to inquire knowledge, to understand the laws of nature, to understand the workings and the mechanics of the universe, because behind it is the grand architect, and that is God Almighty Himself. And this led to the establishment of one of the greatest intellectual schools of learning, known as the Mu'tazilites. The Mu'tazilites originally emerged in the Umayyad era and reached its height in the Abbasid period. After the 10th century, of course, the movement declined for one reason or another. And this school of learning and rational thought was based on the fact that we know that God is the central core of all creation, and asserting that they asserted that if the Quran is the words God, logically God must have preceded it with his own speech. And this philosophical speculation of the Mutazilites centered around the central concept of divine justice and the divine unity. The school worked to resolve theological problems of evil, and of course many other things. And the main thing was how they went about to reconcile that the justice in all of the powerful God with the reality of evil in the world could not coexist. They believe that since God is just and wise, he cannot command what is contrary to reason or act with disregard to the welfare of his creatures. Therefore, all this, what Muslims inherited from Greek, they had to reinterpret. Not just reinterpret, they went on to discover new knowledge. The nature fascinated them. And contrary to what has been, of course, the fictional works of Arabian Nights, that there's some sort of genie in all the works, they needed to know the cause and effect. And of course, they knew the cause of all things was God, but they did not know the effects, how these things
in many
permeated
ways,
in the universe.
This was the intellectual debate between the rationalists and the sort of the theologians of just revelation and accepted knowledge as it is, and those who are rationalists think that everything has to be understood and explained as well. And this carried on into Europe as well.
Oh, absolutely. The Mutazila school, above all, what is known as Kalam and dialectics, postulated that the injunctions of God are accessible to rational mind and inquiry, and to experimentation. Basically, we have now at the CERN, for example, the Large Hadron Collider. This is as a product of Mutazilite theology, school of Kalam, because all of laws of nature could be attested and experimented.
Well, interesting. Al-Kindi was one of the most prominent names of that period, and Al-Mamun had actually, I think it was Al-Mamun, one of the great caliphs, had given him a great responsibility in the the House of Wisdom. And when you look at his Kalam argument in terms of origins of the universe, they're very much in line with what current thinking is, and yet later on,
absolutely,
Newton, Einstein, many of the others thought of the infinite universe of. You
see, there's been always, for instance, in the Christian and the Judo-Christian, that God created the universe and then he rested. Well, in the Muslim theology and philosophy, God has always been there. He's the driver, and of course, I'm using the masculine term here, but God is aloof of gender. He's neither he or she, but just because it's always been expressed like that. So God has not been silent. God has not retired. God has not rested. He has fashioned the universe, and this fashioning of the universe can be ascertained by experimental knowledge. And of course, the whole argument of Kalam, and which is postulated, is the injunctions of God are accessible to rational thought and inquiry, and that it is reason and not some sort of sacred precedent that is effective means of determining what is just, what is obligatory in religion, and so on, what is unjust. So that was the underpinning of the philosophical underpinning of the Mutazilite movement that led to whole revolution within the Islamic political body and thinking. And of course, for some orthodox or who are traditionalists, this became as a kind of shock. It was a shock to the system that how can God's laws be discovered? How could they be experimented upon? Of course, they were not known to them that, of course, one day the age will come about where we could be able to conquer gravity, understand electromagnetism, understand, how the sun works, how the planet works, how the universe works, and so on. And of course, hence the foundations of astronomy, which was known previously as astrology, mumbo jumbo, that somehow these stars determine your fates. No, these stars were there for a reason. They're talked about in the Quran, and of course, it makes the grey blue sky or dark sky look very pleasant at night too. But but of course, they needed to know the basic mechanics of these things. So you find here that one of the at the House of Wisdoms, it was not just Greek sciences of pure hypothesis and theory, or just wondering aimlessly at things. They experimented.
No,
So you had
absolutely.
actually engineers like Al-Jazari. They produced clocks, they produced water wheels, and they provided hydraulics. So that, of course, they provided day to day. That served a dual purpose. One was to investigate nature, but also to be useful to the people of the time as well. So if some science cannot be useful to the people and to overcome their hardships and so on and their daily lives, then that science was meaningless. And of course, the great science of healing, modern surgery, physiology, medicine, and it was not just a curse of God or something that people were inflicted with some disease. There were some reasons for it, and of course, people need to be hospitalized, or people needed to be quarantined. And actually, this is what it was known, and it was something in the air that affected them, or the pollution or the water that affected them. And if they were removed from that scene and they were quarantined or hospitaled, then of course they could be cured, because the great Almighty God, who is merciful and compassionate, cannot afflict mankind these diseases, and they cannot be perpetually cursed with these things.
One of the interesting things, I mean, many of these great names and that we're going to discuss today were polymaths. They were not just physicians, they were musicians, they were mathematicians, they were architects, they had all sorts of interests. And I mentioned, because what I would like to do probably is maybe go through different categories and some of the different great names. And in relation to philosophy, Al-Kindi was one of the foremost, probably the father of philosophy within the Muslim world. But there were other great names in relation to philosophical thinking or speculative thinking, Al-Farabi and Avicenna, or Ibn Sina, as we say as well. But it's a tragedy, though, that rationalist thought that they advocated has died out, and there's a whole history behind that, probably a whole program that we can do. Arif, turning to yourself, in relation to scientific thinking, clearly the Muslims made a great mark in philosophy and philosophical thinking, but it was in the sciences, wasn't it, really, that they made the biggest contribution?
Absolutely. And just to take a step back, I think it's important to make this distinction that in the Umayyad Caliphate, they were very inward-looking. They thought that the Arab culture was superior and that everything that they needed, that could be gleaned from that culture. But there was a move in the Abbasid Caliphate that basically they were much more inclusive. And so, for example, the influences that were there and the knowledge that they gained, it came from Muslim sources, it came from non-Muslim sources. And not only that, is that a lot of their works, although they wanted to translate everything into Arabic, these works were also then translated sometimes into Persian, Turkish, Hebrew, even Latin. And what that meant is that information could be shared between Muslims and non-Muslims as well. So it wasn't that it was just purely Muslim scholars that were learning and progressing. It was also non-Muslim scholars. And what this did is it created an environment where basically Muslims and non-Muslims were working together, as Amjad has mentioned, to understand the world and to progress things and to benefit things. And if I can just read one quote, this was a quote that I think was made in the time of the Abbasid Caliph Harun al-Rashid, and his son Al-Mamun, whose mother was Persian. He was quoted as saying that the Persians ruled for 1,000 years and did not need us Arabs even for one day. So it shows how strong the Persian culture. He went on to say, we have been ruling them for 1 or 2 centuries and we cannot do without them for an hour. So it shows there was a recognition there that they needed each other, and that this facilitated this growth and accelerated the learning. If the Muslims had just said, well, we are the rulers and we know everything, the progress would not have been as great. So as you said, there was a number of medieval thinkers and scientists who have been happy to take that on board, because they know that the spirit in which it was done was to basically facilitate the information and the knowledge that was being gleaned at the time.
Amjad, obviously being a scientist yourself, you've got many heroes that you want to talk about. Pick one, and then I'll mention some others, because there's just so many to
this is the thing. medieval Islamic world, known as the Golden Age of Islam, is also known as the Golden Age of Arabic science. Is they just of course they're all my heroes, and in a reason, in a way, they were polymaths, and I mean Al-Razi is probably one of my heroes. He was a brilliant polymath, and of course he's known as Averroes in the West. And the second one is the great physician and philosopher known in the West as Avicenna, Abu al-Sina in the Muslim world.
I think Averroes is Ibn Rushd.
Sorry, Ibn Rushd, I beg your pardon.
Razi
is somebody else.
Razi is
Sorry, that's Razi. Sorry,
it's okay.
I beg your pardon. Yes, I've got my confused the individuals there. Of course, they're great personalities. There are many astronomers, biologists, chemists, alchemists, economists, social scientists, geographers, and earth scientists, and of course, physicians and surgeons, mathematicians, physicists and engineers. I mean, in the West, when at the time of Newton, when you spoke of the physicist, Newton was never referred to himself. Actually, when in the West people talked about the chemist, they were talking about Ibn Gayber, known in the West as Ibn Jabir, known in the West as Gayber. He was known as the chemist. Ibn al-Haytham, he was known as the physicist at the time of Newton. And when you talked about the physician, you talked about Avicenna. I think Ibn al-Haytham probably is one of the greatest in terms of if you're a physicist, because he was an engineer, he was a physicist, the father of modern optics. I think we won't have a telescope today. Galileo would never have made a telescope and looked at the planet Jupiter if it was not to Ibn al-Haytham, because he's the father of optics. We won't have glasses that we wear today to correct eyesight if it was not for Ibn al-Haytham. Another thing that we attribute to Ibn al-Haytham is the Book of Optics. And for that book, today we have what Archimedes did to burning the fleet. With his mirrors, and that has been lost to history, but accepted is found on the cover of the Book of the Optics, the Archimedes mirror. So he has preserved the ancient knowledge, and he also experimented and opened the doors to what we have today. He contemplated and speculated on the speed of light, and is within 10% of accuracy of the speed of light today.
That's amazing.
And he said that the light has its own origin, i.e., basically also postulated and hypothesized that light has its own carrier particle, what we know today as the photon, the boson. So can you imagine, he had far-reaching insight into what now today is modern knowledge. But unfortunately, we Muslims today, we have lost touch with our own great civilization, and today we're known for all sorts of bad things. But we have a great heritage, and it's unfortunate. And I think our viewers, listeners, if they were to listen to this, and if it kind of inspires the young generation, they should go and head to the libraries, and they will come across these very famous names: Abbas ibn Fanas, Al-Jazari, the Al-Jazari brothers. They founded the clocks, the water clocks, mechanical clocks, and are basically the precursors to modern robotics.
Algebra.
Al-Jazari. We'll come to Algebra in a moment. The Al-Jazari, Bani Musa brothers. The name is Ismail ibn al-Razes al-Jazari. And his date of birth is not known, but he was born in what is now present-day southeast Turkey in the year 1174, and he lived till the year 1200 year. And his book is very famous, and the book today is known as the Book of Knowledge of Ingenious Mechanical Devices. So in modern day, we'll call him a mechanical engineer. We'll also call him a roboticist because he made a lot of robotic devices, and many of his machines because many of his machines incorporated moving figurines. Al-Zawahiri, we know about him. He was a great. He lived in the town of what we now call Madinatul Zahra, which is today known as Cordoba. He died in the year 1013. in the medical curriculums of the European world. His work is well known. He's probably known for cleanliness. Today, hospitals is a very important institution we have for quarantining the sick and maintaining the cleanliness, basically personal bodily hygiene, how germs, he realized diseases are transmitted from person to person, through water, through air, through person to person, what we call today personal cleanliness. So germs are transmitted from person to person. So he founded a whole new science and a physiology with medicine, where he was able to understand just empirically as well as experimentally that diseases are transmitted through these means.
Arif, in relation to medicine, obviously the two great names are Ibn Sina or Avicenna, as Amjad has mentioned, he is known in Europe, and also Al-Razi's as well. Not too long ago, their textbooks were still used in Europe. Do you want to just talk us through the contribution to medicine?
Well, I think the point that Amjad made about understanding medicine is very important, because obviously you wanted to keep your subjects healthy as possible. And this is a fact that I just learnt about Baghdad in the 9th century. At that time, there was over 800 doctors. And what they were doing was they were trying to make discoveries into anatomy and to study the diseases. But the two famous doctors or scientists, first Abu Bakr Muhammad ibn Zakaria, known as Rais, he was a Persian Muslim. And what his particular outstanding contribution was to the medical sciences, chemistry, and he wrote over 200 books, and half of them are on medicine. Now, if anybody knows a medical textbook, it's probably quite a very comprehensive bit of work. And what he was trying to do was basically pass on the knowledge that he learned, wanting other people to enjoy that knowledge and to build upon that. But just some of the achievements that he made: he was the first person to classify chemical substances into mineral, vegetable, animal, and derivatives. He then further classified these minerals into metals, spirits, salts, and stones. He was also credited for describing how to make plaster of Paris, a metallic antimony. And if you just think about the principle of plaster of Paris, even until very recently, that's how people with broken limbs, that's how they were, basically healed. And the Encyclopedia of Islam says about him that down to the 17th century, the authority of Razi was undisputed. In the field of medical practice, he surpasses the knowledge of the ancients. So it shows that his contribution that he made as well. The other scientist that I'd just like to very briefly mention is the Persian scientist Ibn Sina, also known in the West as Avicenna. And he again produced great treatises and works, and these summarize the vast amount of knowledge that has been accumulated. And his two particular works were encyclopedias, you can say, the Canon of Medicine and the Book of Healing. And these greatly influenced and directly influenced the research of European scientists during the Renaissance. So it shows how important these works and how important these scientists were.
Amjad, one of my favorites was Al-Biruni, who interestingly came from the parts of Afghanistan and Samarkand, and he traveled around all that area. Do you want to take us through, his contribution to geological developments were just quite amazing. Just tell us a little bit about it.
Absolutely. He's known as the greatest intellectual who ever lived on the face of the earth, according to George Sarton, and he remarks he was one of the greatest scientists of Islam and all considered one of the greatest of all times. And Professor Salam, Abdul Salam, he mentions that, I quote Professor Salam, and he says he was this is about Al-Biruni. He was an empirical scientist like Ibn al-Haytham. Ibn al-Haytham, I mentioned previously, is the father of the optics and the physicist. He was as modern, as unmedieval in outlook as Galileo 6 centuries later, with whom he shares the independent discovery of the so-called Galilean invariance of the laws of nature, the liberating statement that the same laws of physics apply here on earth as on the starry orbs in the heavens. And this is what Al-Biruni said. Al-Biruni, like many other Muslim scientists, philosophers and mystic poets, believed in the evolution of life, and he is thought to have believed that the primates were the last animals through whom man has migrated to reach his present state. In relation to this claim, a book was written in 1958, and it says that on the assumption, on the presumed Darwinianism of the Al-Biruni, 800 years before Darwin himself. The genius and stature of this great scientist can be seen from the way he assesses the works of Aristotle, the great teacher.
Interestingly, one of the things that the Muslims did was to take away this superstitious belief in things and, experiment and use rationality, etc. And there's an interesting bit about Al-Biruni in terms of taking out medieval superstitions. And it's another quote I'll read. And this is from what he's saying as well. He says, people say that on the 6th of January, there is an hour during which all salt water of the earth gets sweet. Since all the qualities occurring in the water depend exclusively upon the nature of the soil, these qualities are of stable nature. Therefore, this statement is entirely unfounded. Continual and leisurely experimentation will show to anyone the futility of this assertion. And it's the points you made earlier on, that it was the Arabic and Muslim scientists who said, don't just follow any speculation or any superstition, use experimentation. And as for a variety of reasons, is one of my favorites. But it wasn't just in the sciences that the Muslims excelled. Literature also was, but maybe this is an area that we need to pick up in the second part of this program. And then clearly there are things around architecture and many other fields, painting, poetry. So we'll touch on those in the second part of this program. Assalamu alaikum. So welcome back. We were talking about the contributions in the fields of sciences by great Muslim scholars. But science wasn't the only area where Muslims contributed in a big way. There were many other fields, including literature. Arif, I know you've been fascinated by the Arabian Nights. Tell us a bit more. There's a lot more than that, I think.
Absolutely. I mean, I suppose the most famous, and this is fiction, although there may be some stories in there which were based on facts, but the most famous one is the book of 1001 Nights, and another similar book called The Arabian Nights. Sometimes these two terms are used interchangeably, but they are actually slightly different. And this is a collection of basically fables, fairy tales, legends, and parables as well. And this was all collected in the Abbasid area. And this has affected culture right up till the recent days. If you just think about some of the characters that have come out of these books, characters that people will be familiar with: Aladdin, sometimes people, Sinbad, Ali Baba. These have been made into films, Disney films and stories, and these all originated from these works of literature, the original sources. So it just shows how vast and how encompassing the literature was of that time. Poetry was also a great part of the Abbasid era, and poets were given great status at that time. But just to give you another quote about a person who was a writer, but more from a scientific perspective, Abul Hassan al-Masudi. He was born towards the end of the 9th century. He died in 957, and he basically revolutionized the writing of history. And he was doing it from a scientific point of view, in terms of not just accepting what was going on. He would critically study historical events, and instead of just grouping them around years, he would group them around dynasties, and he would elaborate upon them. And the quote that was laid by George Sarton said it's remarkable because of the Catholicity of the author, who neglected no source of information and of his truly scientific curiosity. So it shows that although he was writing a book, he was basically had this scientific curiosity, which meant that the actual work was more complete, and also could be critically analysed as well.
You talked about poetry, Arif. One of my favorite poets and poem is the Rubaiyat of Umar Khayyam, and I know he was a lot more than just a poet, but Amjad, go on. I think he's one of your favorites as well.
Oh, absolutely. The quadrants of Umar Khayyam, known as the Rubaiyat of Umar Khayyam, are well known indeed. And Umar Khayyam was born in Khorasan, province of Iran, in the year 1048 and lived during the golden age of Islam to a ripe old age of 83. He was genius and a gifted polymath. He was a philosopher. You mentioned, of course, he's well known in the West for his poetry, philosophy, mathematics. He was an astronomer and a bit of a geologist too. Very few people realize that he was a first-class mathematician in addition to an astronomer as well. In his own time, he was better known as an outstanding scientist and a metaphysician rather than a poet, and is remembered in Persia today for, of course, his mathematical works and his contribution in devising the Jilali solar calendar in particular. This was named after his patron and is even more accurate than the Gregorian calendar. The latter leads to an era of about 1 day in 3030 years, whereas Al-Khayyam's apparently leads to an era of 1 day in about 5000 years. So this he accomplished at the back of being a very well accomplished astronomer and a record keeper. He was truly an amazing individual, and he's also known for another important works, which is, if you know anything about mathematics, of course he expanded the works greatly of Geber on the treatise and demonstrations on the problems of algebra. And also Khwarizmi, although I'm not sure about the the problem of the quadratics, but either is attributed to Al-Khwarizmi or Umar Khayyam of solving it.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, as I said earlier, many of these thinkers, well, polymaths, they had interest in lots of different areas, but the literature bit is quite interesting because there's quite a strong romantic angle and mystical angle as well. I remember when I was a kid from Kashmir, when I came over to the UK, so many of the cartoons and the films were based on the Arabian Nights, etc. And then, so much in terms of romantic poetry as well of Umar Khayyam. But it was interesting to learn that even Layla Majnun has its origins in the Persian Empire. Is that right?
Yes, it's,
as well? I always thought it to be of Indian latter origins, but there you have it.
Layla, yes, is a lady, and Majnu is bewitched by
it's a sort of Romeo and Juliet
equivalent of a story. And
before Romeo and Juliet.
For 700 years, of course, prior to Romeo and Juliet. And of course, it's based on romance because Majnu is madly in love with Layla and he'll do anything, and he will inflict himself with wounds or with pain, but he just longs to be in the arms of his beloved, and he searches far and wide for her, and he cannot bear to part company with her or the sight of losing her. So he spends
quite a strong religious element in the whole story behind. I know Bollywood tend to fantasize with it a lot more, but I just thought because a lot of the people in the West think the Muslims didn't have any romance in them. But
there is romance as well, and of course it's based on also on the wandering dervish as well. That's another mystical element. So you're searching for your beloved. It could be God Almighty, but before you can, there's a old Sufi saying that you cannot fall in love with God unless you have not fallen in love with a woman. So there's a lot of romance. Of course,
love is central to a human being, isn't it? In many respects, but ultimately it's the love of God which is the most important thing.
There's three things they say, the Sufis: the love of God, the love of your mother, and the love of your partner. That's what completes you as a whole man, and there is a search for being the ultimate man, and you cannot become an ultimate man or rise to a higher plane of existence in the Sufi metaphysical traditions of Islam unless you, of course, have, the love for your mother,
Yeah,
of course, love for your siblings and
Of
your spouses
course.
there, and then ultimately love for God.
Of
And
course.
these are all three are interconnected.
Yeah. And another area where Muslims excelled was in the field of glass and crystal making and also pottery as well, Arif. Do you want to touch a little bit on those?
Yes, I mean, although people might not think of these as significant or major achievements like the science, they were part of the rich culture and rich history that the Abbasid Caliphate has developed. So, just talking about glass and crystal, it's the Near East since Roman times. It's long been recognised as a centre of quality glassware and crystal. And a lot of this originated from Samarra, as we've mentioned in one of the in an earlier part of the program, that this was one of the centres of the Islamic world in the Abbasid area. And this covered a whole range of objects: bottles, flasks, vases, and the decorations on this were very, very intricate, very varied. So they would be, animals, inscriptions, patterns, very intricate patterns. And these were all, encouraged. This was the artistic side, you could say, of the Muslims in terms of what they would decorate the glass and the crystal with, and also in the way in which they developed it. And this is very similar to what was seen on the pottery as well. There's not that much that remains from that time, but what does remain, it shows that, again, there was very rich culture, rich history in this. They were at the forefront of new ideas and techniques. In terms of engraving the pottery, in terms of how they decorated it, in terms of how they coloured it, in terms of the mix of colours that they did. Something which people will identify with is just geometric patterns and the lettering as well. I think Kufic lettering, this came to the floor, and this was very heavily used in pottery. And again, as I said, animals, birds, humans, these were all things which were put on pottery. Also, the types of materials that we used to make the pottery, yellow clay, these were all things that the Abbasids developed because they wanted to produce beautiful items. These were often given to the Caliph for his own personal use or for decorations. And even things like tiles, these were also used and developed from that pottery. So it was, as well as it being beautiful and pleasing to the eye, it was also very functional and also very practical in its use.
One of the things, Amjad, when you go through the sort of the Middle East and the Arabic areas, is the beautiful architecture of some of the palaces and the mosques. Do you want to take us through what sort of contributions they made in relation to architecture? And certainly the dome and the shape of the dome was very, very special, and the minarets and the designs they created.
Oh, absolutely, yes. I think there's been great engineers in the Muslim world in architecture and building buildings, dams, damming the rivers, and they learned and improved a lot from their Greco-Roman predecessors and made new innovations to, for instance, hydraulic engineering, to the capacity to lift, because you needed to build minarets, of course, long, tall towers, and to buttress them and to service them as well. And that required lifting heavy basically materials to elevated heights. So that
in many ways, technology and architecture went hand in hand in terms of what was needed to.
Absolutely, particularly. The hydraulic engineering played significant part. There are, well documented, for instance, treaties on this. Imagine your life today without running water, where you would have walked for miles to a river or a well and then contemplated how to get into the water into your bucket as you could get, and if you get, and how to capture the water, because you have to capture it from a fast-flowing river. And that was the same situation Muslims were faced with, and they, in their daily lives and the daily lives of others. So to improve the lives of others, they undertook groundbreaking innovations of rising water using mechanical machines. And just to quote one of the British engineers, Donald Hill, he was a British chartered engineer, and he quotes, It is impossible to overemphasize the importance of Al-Jazri's work in history of engineering. It provides a wealth of instructions for design, manufacture, and assembly of machines. Al-Jazri lived in southwest Turkey in the 12th and 13th century, and he was employed by one of the kings there. He was fascinated by the improvement and development of mechanical devices, just like modern day engineers who seek optimization as key aspects in improving performance. When you have finished finish your products, water has always played central to it's essential for life, it's essential for commerce, it's essential for maintaining livestock, but also for daily use and cleanliness. Much has been alluded to in the West about the Romans building the aqueducts and taking the waste away, because modern cities cannot flourish without those two facilities. And that was the same thing that occupied Muslim engineers and architects. So you cannot build great metropolises. And of course, Islam wanted to build civilization as a communal life, because the Prophet lived in a city, he migrated to another city. Of course, the vast swathe of Arabia was unsettled and nomadic, but whereas Muslims emphasized in settled life, without that you cannot have civilization and culture.
Yes, I'm just very, very eloquently described all of the practical elements that a big city would need. But I was surprised to hear that, for example, in a city like Samarra, the Muslims and the engineers and the architects also designed race courses and game preserves. So it shows that, in a city, as well as all the practical things, you do need things for leisure as well. So I remember a few years ago that in Dubai they were building a race course in the desert. So maybe they've taken some inspiration from these early Muslims who were able to build a race course in a city like Samarra. So it shows that as well as being practical and functional, they did also have an artistic side. They also wanted their subjects to enjoy their city. You could form that could form part of what you would call town planning these days. Green belt areas and areas for enjoyment, as well as having things that were practical and functional as well. That was all part of the architecture and the planning that they did.
There's also a verse in the Quran in Surah 21:30 where God asserts that He made, and He says, "Verily we made from water every living thing," and of course. Like I mentioned, without water, one cannot flourish, one cannot live, cities cannot grow and develop. But just emphasizing that, the water wheels and the aqueducts have been around, but Al-Jazri's reciprocating pump in particular made enormous contributions to modern civilization, and that the reciprocating pump is the precursor to the modern steam engine, the modern piston, and this crankshaft. Those two components, this piston, the reciprocating pump, and the crankshaft, without those, we won't have the modern car, the modern form of transportation. And that truly, the honor goes to Al-Jazri, and there's no denying in that. This is well researched. Our listeners can go and look this up, that they influenced those, the scientists of the golden age of Islam continue to, they are now obviously passed into history, but we only, unfortunately, the Muslim world is becoming inward looking and is tearing itself apart, but the rest of the world continues because of the legacy of those great scientists and engineers of the golden age of Islam.
We also touched on earlier the link with China through the various campaigns that the armies had, and the incorporation of paper making and gunpowder as well. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? Because clearly paper making made a massive contribution, not only in terms of reproducing the copies of the Holy Quran, but all the other literature in the mills that followed.
Absolutely. I think we've touched upon this before, where books were translated, books needed to be written down. I think I read somewhere that a person translating could make a very good living because there were so many books that needed translating, and these would obviously then be published into books and circulated. It also made record keeping very strong, as well as you mentioned, about copies of the Holy Quran. But the techniques for making paper, they were also improved upon, and this helped having that link with China. So with respect to gunpowder, which was something else you mentioned, the formulas, the potassium nitrate and the explosives, they were also developed and they were also enhanced. The links with China also helped in other areas. These led on to improvements in irrigation and in farming. This links in with the use of water, as Amjad has just mentioned as well. And even things like windmills, which helped obviously the irrigation of crops and development of other fruits. So almonds and citrus fruits, they were brought not through China, but brought to Europe, and also sugar. So it shows that the Muslims and the caliphs of that time were thinking about practical things which would benefit the people, ways of improving the situation and making things more efficient as well. Because although it might have been possible to grow crops, if you improve irrigation, you improve the quantity of crops, and you reduce the time and effort that's required to produce these items as well.
Another, of course, science that owes its legacy to the Muslims is the code breaking and cryptology. The word cipher, of course, comes from the word zero or cipher in Arabic, and the word the zero came from North Africa into modern Europe through Leonardo of Pisa, known as Fabiucci in the West, and one of the leading cryptologists in his book, he remarks that the birth of cryptology requires society which has reached a high standard of development in three disciplines, namely linguistics, statistics, and mathematics. These conditions became available at the time of Al-Hindi, who commanded all three disciplines and more. So that's also a branch that... For instance, people talk about the Bletchley Park and the Enigma machine and deciphering the military and coded traffic during World War II. But that work and that machine wouldn't have been possible without the work of Al-Hindi cryptology, basically the binary numbers 0 and 1, and of course you required all those three things: mathematics, linguistics, and statistics, and they all, according to Dr. Simon Singh, he published a book called The Code Book in 1999. And if any of our listeners want to research this, they're quite welcome to. So here's another legacy that many people do not know is in the field of code breaking and cryptology.
One of the most important things you just mentioned there was the introduction of the zero. And that was a concept. Zero is from the Hindu civilization, really. But Arif, take us through, because without that zero, as many of the Indian commentators say, man would not have been able to go to the moon. There's a beautiful song, isn't it, in relation to that? And that is absolutely true. But it was the Muslims which actually incorporated the zero into all the different mathematical equations and whatever. But just take us through that.
What happened with it became much more prevalent and much more widespread and much better understood as well. And mathematicians were struggling without a unified way of how to record zero. It made obviously a lot of their calculations very difficult.
Because prior to that, they were using the Roman,
that's right.
And God knows how many pages it takes to create a formula.
How would you encompass the Roman numerals in equations, and how I don't even know how you would write zero in the Roman numerals. But yes, obviously this helped, and it made great significant advances as well. I just want to pick up on one small point that Amjad was just built upon about the cryptology, the cartography as well. What this enabled was much better navigation. Previously, when going across or getting from one point to another point, ships would just skirt across the border. And because of the better navigational techniques and mapping, ships were actually able to sail directly from one point to another point. So again, this enhanced trade. There was more confidence. People knew where they were going. And again, this was built upon the discoveries and the mapping that the Muslims in the Abbasid era were able to develop.
Now, in relation to sort of arithmetic, algebra as a term, that has its origins in the Muslim world. So, Amjad, do you want to take us through that? Because Every school kid comes across this term, and most, I suspect, won't have a clue where it came from. But clearly, it was a Muslim scientist contributor who gave this term to us.
Yeah, Al-Khawarizmi. And the word algorithm is basically comes from his name. He was a great mathematician and polymath, and he basically is the father of the work and on mathematics and the book is called the treatise on algebra, and hence the word aljabr is the word used in his book, and that famously became algebra, and I think many mathematicians and Nobel laureates, when they speak of Muslims, they say that we in Europe think in terms of Euclid, and Euclid is of course Euclidean geometry and calculus, and they speak in terms of Pythagoras, so it's all Greco-Roman and it's geometry. When Muslims think, they think algebraically.
Yes,
And this was also said when Professor Dr. the late Professor Dr. Abdul Salam, when he was doing his doctoral work at Cambridge. In the West, when they did these certain calculations on Einstein's relativity and his works, they always came with infinity in equations, and this was unacceptable. In mathematics, you can't have infinity. So the first time when he worked around and applied his mind to it, he was able to solve it, and later on his contemporaries, they'll say that Salam, you think, because you can solve these because you think algebraically.
Yes, yeah. That's fascinating. Well, I think we've had a great discussion about some of the Abbasid Golden Age contributions. Is there anybody you think we've left out, Amjad? I mean, we've covered some of the great names, and there's many, many more, I'm sure.
There is, of course, Abbas ibn Fanas, and he produced a flying machine, and he's also worked
Yes,
on...
that's a fascinating one as well, isn't it?
And yes, and long before the Wright brothers produced their glider and tested it at Kitty Hawk, he... it's difficult to pin one profession on the Cordobian scientist, but he had many talents, including poetry, astronomy, music, and he was also fluent in Greek, and translated many philosophical and musical manuscripts. But of course, he's well known in the Muslim world, medieval world, for producing his famous kite and the glider. One legend has it that he took it on a embankment on a cliff and then sailed abruptly into the wind, but landed rather harshly and managed to dislocate some of his bones in his back, and was confined to his bed for the rest of his life. But then again, here you go, here's somebody who experimented with flying as well.
In this program, we've just tried to cover the Abbasid golden period. Of course, there was the second Umayyad period in Spain, and in the next program, we will cover that period as well, because there was another glorious contribution that really gave the light of the European Enlightenment. But let me finish today's program with a quote from George Sarton's book in relation to the Muslim contributions in the sciences and various other fields. It says thus: from 500 to 450 BC is the age of Plato, followed by the ages of Aristotle, Euclid, Archimedes, and so on. From 750 CE to 1100 CE, however, it is an unbroken succession of the ages of Jabir, Khwarizmi, Razi, Masudi, Abul Wafa, Al-Biruni, and Umar Khayyam. In those 350 years, Arabs, Turks, Afghans and Persians, chemists, algebraists, clinicians, geographers, mathematicians, physicists and astronomers of the Commonwealth of Islam held the world stage of sciences. Only after 1100 CE, in Sarton's scheme, do the first Western names begin to appear. However, for another 250 years, they share the honors with men of Islam like Ibn Rushd, Nasiruddin Tusi, and Ibn Nafis. This actually was from Professor Abdul Salam's writings in relation to the renaissance that's needed in the Muslim world. So thank you for your contributions. I hope listeners have found this useful. Until the next program, Assalamu alaikum, goodbye.